David Vizard here, and you're watching Paratech 10. As you may guess, I'm putting this video together piece by piece because once I'd got started in part 1, I realized that it wasn't going to get finished in part 1. So, here we are. This is part 2, episode 119. Now, you will notice some breaks where suddenly my shirt changes, but that's because there's no logical order to do these things. So if it's a bit spotty one place to another, it's because categorizing all the things I'm going to tell you is going to be not impossible, but just a little difficult for somebody who's not got a good memory in terms of what I see from my videos, right? I can remember incidences way back 40 or 50 years, but my short-term memory and sometimes my long-term memory are a little impaired. But anyway, let's get going here. As I said, this is episode 119, so here we go. If you're coming into this game as a newbie, it wouldn't be much of a surprise for me to think that you believe that lightning reaction times are one of the #1 priorities. Not so. To start putting this in some sort of order, let me say that awareness of the surrounding cars and what they're doing is far more important. I'll give you an example here. Graham Hill did not have lightning reactions. He was very much average. However, he was very cognizant of what was going on around him. Another way of putting it is he wasn't the sort of guy that suffered from target fixation. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of this with fighter pilots who get fixated on their target and they forget to look in their rear view mirror to find out if anything's making them their target. Well, the problem is that target fixation is very common. Not having target fixation isn't very common. Now, what you need to do here is not get glued to the car in front of you. You need to always be aware of what it's doing, but look and see what the cars that are maybe 2 rows of the grid or equal to that distance in front of you, because they will do something which this guy has to do something and this guy has to. But if they're all suffering from target fixation, and probably 9 times out of 10 they will be, their reaction time won't be worth a darn, because they will have to make a decision first to do something, right? And in their mind, they're just fixated on don't lift, go as fast as you can. Well, if that wrecks your car, you're not going to win a race. So target fixation can be countered by awareness. Moving on, something that brings about awareness is focus on what you're doing. Many people tend to lose focus, and I must admit, in a long race, and I'm talking about long, something over an hour, and maybe approaching 4 or 5 hours. Cup car guys are a good example of this. You realize that a typical race goes on for something like 3 hours. Staying focused for that 3 hours is very, very difficult. It's mentally exhausting. But if you want to win a race and avoid an accident, that's what you have to do. Focus all the time, even right down to the last detail. Doing so allows you to get some kind of prediction of what's going to happen in front of you. That's good. If you can sense that a guy up front is on the limit and is trying to keep in front of somebody, maybe you, be aware. You need to anticipate him having an accident. Now, this awareness of the shape of things to come, is not a natural ability. It's acquired by focusing on what's going to happen and recognizing what somebody's style of driving is and the possible consequences. Now, all of this sounds like it's black magic, but it's not. It comes with experience, and it comes with the fact that I've now told you need to do this, so now you're aware of it. Let's move on. Now, I did say this was all going to be a little disjointed, and it is. Just mentioned seats back there and steering wheels, and I've got a couple of points that I left out. Seating first. You will see many a race car driver tucked down in the seat low. Sometimes that's unavoidable because they're driving a Formula type car, and lowering it is good for cornering. But let's talk about sedans, because as a beginner you're not going to start in a Formula car, or very unlikely to. The thing with this is that braking and cutting your distance and judging where you're going to brake is very important. You cannot do that as well from a low set seat. Sit yourself in the car as high as possible. Why? Because you'll have a better plan view of the road in front of you. Very important. Basically, you need to be able to get to the point where you can brake within a foot every time coming into a bend, and brake at the very last moment. That's easier to do from a high seating position. Now, steering wheel. Many of you, I'm sure, will have noticed that when you look inside when you get to see the inside of a cup car whilst they're driving, the steering wheel's almost in their lap. Now, I think that that's come about more by convention than anything else, because a steering wheel down low is not the best point for you to have control of the car. Sure, you can get used to it, and sure, if you've got enough upper body strength, it's no problem, and if you've got power steering. However, it is better to have the steering wheel much nearer a tractor position where it's flat to you like this. Now, there isn't room in every car to do this, right? Take a look inside a Mini if you ever get to see one. Their steering wheels are very flat, and a lot of people would lower that steering wheel because it looked racier. No, you can pull on a steering wheel like this and push like this here with much more force and move it with much more speed, boom, boom, like that, than you can down here going like this, right? Just try that out and see what loads you could exert with a pull and a push and then a downward one like this. This is much more powerful. So raise the steering wheel as far as you possibly can. At first it may seem a little uncomfortable, but trust me, you'll be faster. Subject here is tire pressures, both for the wet and the dry. Now, let me make an obvious statement here. Well, I think it's probably obvious. The worse your suspension is, the more critical the tire pressure gets. Or that's the general trend. For instance, my Cosworth Sierra that I was driving from Mountune and Kent Cams, at Brands Hatch, 1 pound a square inch off the ideal pressure was 1 second a lap. Well, Hell, if the racing's competitive, that's too much to give away. In fact, anything is too much to give away. Now, that was in the dry. In the wet, it was more a question, and I'm talking about wet now, not damp, wet. It was more a question of how well the rubber could grip on a wet road where it was actually forcing the water away, and how much water it could force away. So the thing is if you put the tire pressure up, it tends to open up the treads. That will get rid of water better. Also, it will tend to round the tires. Now, how much should you put it up? Well, most tires are limited to 50 psi, but I've often found that approaching that number works well. Often approaching that number. Not always. When you go out in the wet, the first thing you should do is test upwards, i.e. generally increase your tire pressure until you find out where it's good. It needs to be more focused on the tires which are predominantly on the outside of the car. Now on a road course, that is going to be the left-hand side tires as you're sitting in the car. If you're an oval track, and of course most people don't race in the wet on oval track, of course it would be the right-hand side tire. Now, let's look at the tire pressures in terms of a track which has curbs rather than walls that are the limiting where the edge of the track falls. Two things here. I'll explain the first one down the road when we get into suspension more, and that is if it's racing on a purpose-built track which normally have curbs, then it is better to have the roll center lower on the front. This will give it a tendency to pick up that wheel. If it's a wall, you want the roll center up. Now, how much difference does that make? I'll explain that when I get into that for serious. Now, as far as tire pressures are concerned, if you are curbing the car on a track with curbs rather than a wall as the delimiting factor, then you need to have softer tires on the inside adjacent to the wall. Now, most tracks are going to go around turning to the right, which means you'll have a harder tire on the outside and a softer tire inside. Now, why is that? Well, it's quite simple. When you get good at this game, you will find that charging the curbs is the fastest way around the track. And I mean charging them aggressively. You go into that corner deliberately with too much speed, knowing that you're going to go across that curb and onto the grass, whatever. You will find that's the fastest way around. And I'll give you an example of that. Way back when I was testing at Silverstone, I noticed there was an Australian driver, can't remember his name, a damn good driver, but that's common for Australians. They breed drivers in Australia, by the way. You can be a thoroughbred driver or not. It doesn't seem like there's anything between. Anyway, what happens is this. If you've got a sedan and you've set it up so that you can charge the curbs, and this guy was driving, this Australian driver, was driving a Rover SD1, that's the V8 Rover, a British Touring Car Championship entry, and he was practicing there. There was also a guy driving a Porsche, one of the higher performance ones. It wasn't a turbo one, but it was way up there. Porsche, a street one for sports racing, for sports car racing. Now, the Porsche sat down on the road through all the bends, great. He couldn't charge the curb at the speed that the Rover could. Why? He'd end up with a whole pile of broken suspension really quickly. The Rover, on the other hand, had tougher suspension. Now, They changed the bend at Woodcut, I don't know, 30 years ago. And it's now got like an S bend in it. I noticed when these two cars came into the corner that the Porsche had to brake a lot earlier and take the bend slower. So much so that the curb charging Rover came over the curb, literally about 4 feet over it, and caught him up. That Rover was catching up that Porsche because of the extra speed through that turn. It wasn't until the next turn, which was more not so forgiving in terms of curb height, which made it a little difficult to charge the curb, did the Porsche start to pull away from the Rover again. When they came round again, it was almost the same deal, except the Porsche was slowly gaining on that Rover. But when they were close, you could see that Rover pull up on that Porsche right on the exit of the bend. He was literally 5 or 6 miles an hour faster through that bend. So that is why you must tune the suspension in terms of tire pressure to be able to attack the principal bends by flying over the curb. Now you will get some marshals pull you up for it, and then you're kind of stuck. I had a situation where I was told not to drive over the grass, right? That's not where the track is. And I pointed out to the marshals that I wasn't touching the grass. And I said, look, the motorcycle guys lean out over the grass, you don't complain about them. I am having my car, it rolls to the extent that it's sometimes up on 2 wheels. Never touches the curb or the grass. And I said I will continue to do it and we will contest this after. Well, they didn't bother to contest it because there was a very real reason for me doing it. Anyway, I was much faster than any cars that were in my class for that, so that's one. So how do we arrive at the right tire pressures? Well, that's a $64,000 question. I hate to mention it, but seat time's part of it. Getting to know how your car handles to the slightest change. However, that's a bit of a blasé reply there. A technique I've used is to get these tire pressure valves, which when you set the tire pressure, if it goes up, it vents the excess tire pressure, so that you can go out with tires which are, if you know what they should be, you can go out with tires at that pressure. As they heat up, so they will vent tire pressure back to that setting you had. So that gives you a good idea of what differences there may be that you need in the tires. However, at the end of the day, you have to stop and focus on these tire pressures and imagine what's going on with them. Inevitably, you need the outside wheels of the way the track turns harder than the inside wheels. And a good starting point for a production sedan, and remember for this project we are on street tires with a 400 or more tread wear rating. With tires like this, about 45 psi in the outside wheels as a starting point. On the inside wheels, whatever the tire pressure recommended, put in about 3 to 4 pounds more. Right, that may bring your tire pressure to about 40 pounds. Now, when you go out, test these tire pressures, start with the inside ones first and see how they ride the curb. When you get comfortable with that, and they'll probably come down, go to the outside ones and progressively let them down. You will need to have harder tire pressures at the front than at the back, because mostly cars have more weight on the front. Figure about 3 pounds more on the front than on the back. and that should be a good starting point. Well, I've reached the 25-minute mark just about, and so I'm going to wrap this part 2 of the subject up, and just say that in the next part 3, we'll talk about shock absorbers, springs, and anti-roll bars. That is, in American terms, anti-sway bars. So don't forget to like, subscribe, notify, whatever works. I'll see you the next time. Thank you for watching.